Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure some more will start rolling in as the morning unfolds. But I want to thank you all for joining our third quarter REF Women's Network conversation today. We are expecting another educational and interactive conversation based on how to lead, support, or advocate for changes that could be made to foster women's success in your organization and or your local community. The REF Women's Network continues to embrace and align with the United Nations theme in 2024 of investing in women. As many of us know, while progress is being made, we know there's a lot of work to be done in a lot of areas to basically create working environments where all employees thrive. I'm Susan Caravella. I'm one of the REF partners in San Diego and forum leader and co-lead one of our CEO groups. I'm also co-champion with Carolina Lobet of the REF Women's Global Network. I'm a former CEO, former CFO, and I'm now an executive coach and a business consultant. And I've spent most of my career in male-dominated industries, so I'm looking forward to seeing what's changed since I was in those environments. And I have a passion for developing women leaders at all levels. And with me as co-host is Carolina Lobet, and I'll let her take it from here.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Welcome, Christine and Jessica. I'm Carolina Llobet, a REF partner and forum leader from Bolivia, and co-champion of REF Global Women with Susan. So I'm really glad to be here. And I would like to introduce our two guests today. Jessica Grounds. In 2016, Jessica Grounds co-founded Mind the Gap, which partners with companies, organizations, and government agencies to create more effective, inclusive workplaces. She co-authored reports about the impact of SB 826, the first in the nation legislation to require women board directors on public health companies headquartered in California, and serve as an expert witness on related court cases challenging the diversity laws passed by the state legislature. Jessica also serves as NASDAQ Board Insight Council and currently serves as the CEO for the Corporate Directions Forums in San Diego, where she makes diversity and inclusion central her work. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you for being here. And in the other side of my screen, I have Christine Haffett, as she's a co-founder and Mind the Gap, and prior as CEO of Haffett Group and Director of Women Programs in the Nation Democratic Institute for International Affairs, with offices in 70 countries. She has consulted Fortune 500 companies, governments, UN agencies, global financial institutions, and leading philanthropies and nonprofits on diversity, equity, and inclusion. She also spearheaded global gender equality initiatives such as the Madeleine Kill Albright Grant, Win the Woman, and I Know Politics. Mind the Gap has developed Amazon Web Services' first internal DEI program in 2016 and has conducted research on culture in the workplace with FTI Consulting, a Fortune 100 company, and has had the Tiger Work feature on Bloomberg, Fast Company, and MSNBC. Welcome, Christine. Today, we have a great day. We are focusing on the crucial role that inclusive environments play in empowering diverse talents, especially women in leadership. Our discussion will draw from the principles championed by organizations like Mind the Gap, which emphasize the importance of cultural competency and intersectional diversity in unlock the full potential of any workforce. Together, we'll explore actionable strategies to build more inclusive spaces that not only attract, but also retain and elevate diverse leaders. Let's dive into this critical conversation. Christine and Jessica, the panel is all yours.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Carolina. Thank you, Susan. We are thrilled to be here today. We're really happy to be with REF, and we're grateful to be with all of you. So we're looking forward to the discussion today. Just to give you a sense of what we are going to do, we'll tell you a little bit about Mind the Gap, and then we will talk about some key trends that we are really, where we're seeing that women are still being held back in the workplace. And then we'll get into some key recommendations for how we see women can be, where we can advance women in the workplace. And really, we want this to be a discussion and hear, what you're experiencing and how, how we can have a discussion about what would be helpful for you. So Mind the Gap is a company that Jessica and I started about 8 years ago, actually almost exactly 8 years ago. And we started it mainly really to focus on supporting the private sector to advance women leaders. And Jessica and I, the company has focused on advancing DEI for the private sector with a very specific expertise in advancing women's leadership, especially. We started Amazon Web Services for DEI internal DEI program 8 years ago, and really have expanded the DEI services that we've provided over the years. But we came to this from working with women in leadership for over 25 years. And both of us started working with women in politics, and have worked with women in more than 100 countries, and really decided to work with women in the private sector because we saw that the experiences that women in the private sector were having and the challenges that they were having were very similar to what we saw women were having in politics and across other sectors. And so we created our company to really go into companies, to do assessments, to really understand, what were the challenges that companies were having, what were the challenges that women were having, and to really do strategy work with companies, do the advising to help advise companies on how they could take steps to really support women's leadership. And so, I'll turn it over to Jess so she could tell you a little bit about herself and get into the key trends. But the good news is, when we really started this work, it was all, the dialogue was really about how do you fix women, and how do you tell women how to be better? How do you support women in being more confident, and how do you encourage women to negotiate better and to lean in and to sit at the table, so to speak, and really per the title of our conversation today, Driving Women's Success Through Inclusive Leadership, the dialogue today is really about inclusion, because the conversation now is really about changing the culture of the workplace and creating an inclusive workplace. It's about changing the dynamic to create a culture that's for everyone, and changing the environment rather than really, focusing on changing women. Now, that said, we do continue to train women, and there are a lot of things that we need to work with women on to navigate the workplace, and Jessica will talk about a little bit about that shortly. But that's the great news. And that said, while we've seen that great progress, we continue to see a lot of the same challenges that we've seen since we got into this work 25 years ago. So with that, I'll pass the floor to Jess to get into some of these key trends that we've seen that have evolved over the years, but that probably won't surprise many of you, and probably will seem familiar to you, and that we can kind of unpack more so in the recommendations as we get further into the conversation. So thank you again for being here today, and we're looking forward to the conversation. Jess.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Hi, everybody. Good morning and buenos dias for those of you, I think, who are some native Spanish speakers. Kristen we've been doing this work for a long time, and it's kind of fun for me to be in this platform to sort of talk through all of these things and share sort of our wisdom over the years and learn from you. Kristen's an incredible, global expert in this work. And just to kind of emphasize again what she said, I think in both of our work, traveling all over the world, thinking about the dynamic of gender equity in the workplace and in politics, which is our start, as Kristen mentioned, the barriers we see are basically very similar across the world, which I think is really sad but empowering to know that we have these universal dynamics impacting women. The scale can be different depending on the cultural context. I trained women to be leaders in Lesotho, and you have a different dynamic there than you might in another country. But I think that's a real interesting thing to kind of couch this in, that this is, there's uniqueness in cultural um, understanding that we need to have within different cultural contexts, but a lot of the barriers, I can list the same barriers we see for women in different parts of the world, and there's, nodding of heads of women. And so I think that's an interesting thing to start with. And before I get into these trends that Kristen mentioned about what we're seeing in the workplace, I do want to also be really clear about kind of the two sides that we tend to see as the challenge for women. Kristen referenced this, that oftentimes in the workplace, we focus on training women to be confident and these internal issues. That is frustrating, but is also, there's a realness to that. So a lot of the work I did for many years was inspiring young women to lead in politics. I co-founded an organization in 2007, which is still around, called Running Start. And the idea of that was that we in the United States were not seeing a lot of women in political leadership roles running for office. The number of them running for office was a much smaller percentage compared to men. And so our thesis, or our thinking, was that if we inspired young women at an early age to build their confidence to lead, they would have ambition to get into an industry that they hadn't felt welcome to before. And that's still true. We still need to build the pipeline and nurture women to be leaders in places they haven't been. And so that's not gone. But that at the same time is held with this other side, which Kristen talks about, these structural dynamics. Why is the workplace still keeping women from succeeding when they're qualified and they're capable to be there? Those are structural dynamics that are, in some ways, I think, more difficult to overcome. And that's really what Mind the Gap has focused on. Again, less on focusing on training the women and more on thinking about what policies exist. What are the leaders talking about? How is the system itself actually impacting women to be successful when we know that they're the, again, I keep referencing my own home country, but in the United States, that #1 graduates from college and even graduate schools, but aren't rising to the top of leadership. So to just go to these 5 trends, I'm going to speak about a couple of them. So these are main areas we still see impeding women succeeding. And again, as Kristen said, these are not going to be shocking. The #1, and this is just, I think, even more powerful today post-COVID than it has been, it's flexibility. So Kristen and I did sweeping research across 5 industries about what is holding women back with FTI Consulting, as Carolina mentioned in her bio. And #1 variable or a thing that could help the women succeed is flexibility. When we looked at that, that was both men and women respondents. And so we tend not to see flexibility. I'll just give an example again here in the United States. We, post-COVID, instead of completely reimagining the workplace after COVID, we have many companies, especially in the finance sector, going back to work 5 days a week, when the research is pretty clear that hybrid work and flexibility at home was really more effective for keeping women in. I think this is happening. It's actually accelerating in my experience. So I think rethinking, what does flexibility look like? Of course, that's coupled not only with the day-to-day work, but also the policies of women's lives. We bear children typically more often, right? We tend to have more of the care work on our shoulders, both at home for family and also children. And so that dynamic of paid leave, United States still does not have universal paid leave. Many companies have adopted policies for both paternity and maternity leave, but it's still a minority of companies, not a majority of companies in the United States. And I'm sorry, I'm speaking from the US context, and I know our European friends have more flexibility in other parts of the world. Kristen and I have done quite a bit of work in China, in Japan, and so a little, not as much in China, maybe one day, in Japan. And that is a dynamic where we definitely see the dynamic of flexibility, the burden that women have to raise children and work is just super incongruent with success, and they're seeing a decline in population and a real economic impact. So flexibility is a huge one. #2, feeling undervalued in the workplace. This is something we see all the time in our culture assessments, where women do not feel that they are seen and valued in the same way. And, a real practical example of this is we tend to still see women in those administrative roles and in the support roles and not in the leadership roles. That in and of itself reflects to the organization where value is and where trust is among women. And I would also argue that I even see quite a bit senior male leaders often, not always. And of course, some of the best champions for women are those important male leaders who are in the CEO roles more often at the top. But I often see those senior leaders not necessarily almost trusting the views of women as much, or not allowing them to have the opportunity to talk about their own experience. And this gets into the recommendations, excuse me, of what we can do about this, but really recognizing that we are in contexts in which women are not seen and valued in the same way. And so how can we help, even if maybe the leaders think they do value women, what can they be doing to actually reflect that and change that? So lack of recognition, again, the positions are a really big part of that. And then the third piece, before I pass it back to Kristen, I'll talk about is kind of, I hate the frame we have is women getting in their own way. There is a dynamic still that we tend to see many women often being, whether it's oftentimes more male dominated fields or not, where they feel like if I just work hard, I'm going to be seen, I'm going to be appreciated, and I'm going to move forward. And I think the reality is we're all trying to create a workplace that is more inclusive of men and women's styles and a broader range of how leadership can look. And right now, in certain sectors, it isn't very different. It is still really difficult. And so, what I often see women lacking is the ability to have kind of what I would say political or social capital, building their ability to navigate office politics and building influence in themselves. And so, I think that is a more sophisticated reality that I think for a longer time, because men have been in leadership, they have learned and they've been mentored or taught how to navigate, how to build influence and how to be seen and be seen as credible. So that's a place in which I would say in some ways women get in their own way. But again, I think they that is something we can learn and teach, and I think is an important thing for us to recognize as we're evolving these workplaces to be more equitable and to be more effective to really bring out the talent we have in women. So Kristen, I'm going to pass it back to you for the last two.
Sure. So the fourth trend that we have here, we see in global research, and it also came out of the research that Jessica and I did in that global study that Jess mentioned a couple of minutes ago. It came out as two separate things. Women are leaving their companies because of lack of opportunities for career advancement, and because of seeing that their peers are being paid more at other companies. And so we see that both with women and with millennials and Gen Z, for example, that they know that they have a lack of opportunities for career advancement because in part they are seeing that they don't see people like themselves in leadership roles. And one of the things we see in research is that there's a perception that even when you have kind of a couple of women in senior positions, there's a perception by leadership that and by others that you have a lot of women in leadership, when in fact you just have a handful. When you actually look at the numbers, it's just a small percentage of women. But when you have these women in leadership, there's a perception that it's more than there are. So these lack of opportunities for career advancement is one of the things that sends women away. And we saw during the pandemic that during the Great Resignation, that a lot of women left their careers, left the work world, and there's a myth that they left and they stayed home, but a lot of them actually went and started their own businesses. And then on lower pay, we know that the global gender pay gap is still about 20%, And you see, and we'll talk about it in the recommendations, but you see a lot of companies now. I mean, Salesforce was one of the very big companies to start with a major gender audit and commit to doing it annually, to look at the gender pay gap in their company. And then Jessica and I were looked at a really interesting and unique public-private partnership in the US that was done by the city of Boston and 5 major companies, major private sector companies in Boston, including State Street, Global Advisors, financial company that anonymously collected the salaries of men and women, and to actually figure out what the gender pay gap was, or if there was a gender pay gap, and certainly found out that there was, as a way to start to figure out, how to get at this issue. And so, and now you see individual cities in the US, but laws being passed to not be able to ask women what their past salaries were in order to get around pay gap issues. And then microaggressions continue to be an issue in the workplace, which are in some cases deliberate and in some cases are not deliberate. And these are consistent measures that are taken to marginalize underrepresented groups through behaviors such as that are undermining, that are behaviors like talking about their appearance or their personal decisions. It could be things like not inviting people to meetings where important decisions are being made. There are things like, we call it office housework, where there'll be an office party and everyone will leave, for someone's birthday, for example, and everyone will leave the room, and the women are expected to, pick up the plates and the cups, clean up after the party. So, but over time, the point is that all of these different things and behaviors that happen, they wear people down, and it doesn't take very long for this to happen. And in the aggregate, these are the things that create a really poor culture. And this is what makes people not want to be in a place. And if you look at all of these 5 trends, really what we're talking about here is poor work culture, right? And so that's, when we talk about inclusion is about creating a positive work culture where people want to be where they are. And what that requires is thinking about, who is there and what does the workplace need to be for them. And we know that women and men have different lives, and thus they experience the workplace differently. And we need to think about that in terms of how we craft the policies, but also how we think about the culture that's there too. And so we need to think about not just what the policies look like, but really what the behaviors are, because both of these, as I said, they both define the workplace culture. And the behaviors are less tangible, but that's where we think about what are the values in the workplace that we have, and we have to define those just as importantly as we have to do with the policies. So that's a little bit about the trends that we've been seeing over the years. And again, these are things that we continue to see. For example, I'm working with a company that Jessica and I worked with 4 years ago that are having some of the similar problems that they have, but they've made great strides, and they're based in the United States in Washington, DC. And then right now we're also working with companies in the Arab world that have very similar challenges, but it's just the degree is very different, right? So it's amazing to see, you know, we're really working on the exact same issues. It's just, you know, the range of the degree is different, and it's amazing to see, you know, how the issues are the same. So here are some of the recommendations that we have for all of you to consider, and we would love to hear what some of you have been thinking about and implementing in your companies to try to really work towards inclusion. And we know that, you know, just creating a more diverse environment is really only the first step. Inclusion really means creating that culture and creating that environment where a diverse group of people, whether it's ethnicity, racial, gender, you know, everyone feels like they can show up as themselves and contribute and be their best at work, so that you are getting the best of them, and that your company is really succeeding in the way it can and being as competitive as it can. So the first is really showing a personal commitment to inclusion. Just making sure, yeah, okay. Is showing a personal commitment to inclusion. So, you know, making that visible and making sure that as a leader, you're making sure that other people know that this is a priority for you. And so that really means making sure that within your organization, you're making it known, and that also on a day-to-day basis that you're leading, you know, with inclusion as an intentional purpose, as a part of your leadership. And so that's holding others accountable for how they behave. That's calling out bias. You know, that's not just, you know, going along with the status quo. And that's what being an inclusive leader is about. It's not about going along with the status quo. And that's, you know, that's how we're really going to change things. It's about being curious about others. You know, it's about, you know, being collaborative and really making an effort to be open to doing things differently because you're embracing difference. The second one is aligned but different. It's making sure that inclusion is a deliberate corporate priority. So you're making this a stated priority of the organization. And so what that requires is making sure, as I was just mentioning, that this is a part of the company's values and goals, which, as I said, that comes into, you know, the behaviors bucket, right? So you've got the policies and the behaviors. So you're making sure that this is, you know, the company's values are clear, because that tells people how to behave, you know, and how they're supposed to operate. And we know from research that you need support from top leadership for any diversity and inclusion efforts to be successful. So if you don't have that, we know that there isn't going to be success. And when Jessica and I are doing this work, we've been fortunate to work with companies where that is happening, and we don't even try to really engage with companies where we know that that's not going to be the case, because then we know that they're just checking the box and doing, for example, unconscious bias trainings, right? And that's not going to go anywhere if they don't have support from the top. So that's really critical. And so, and then as a part of that, you want to make sure you're measuring, you know, you're having the KPIs, and you're having reporting structure. Someone's responsible for, you know, meeting these commitments. And as we all know, if you're not measuring things, you know, it doesn't get done, right? And just quickly, I mean, we can touch on this later, but we know that there's a business case to this. And just so a few statistics that we stuck in here in between that you can use, and there, since Jessica and I have been doing this work, there are a myriad of research reports and documents, some that, there's a Wall Street Journal article the other day where people are starting to trying to refute some of the biggest studies, like by McKinsey, that have done that of this research that have been around for a long time. But it's long documented that inclusive and diverse teams are more profitable. They are quicker at getting goods and services to market. They're more innovative. And we know that boards that have more women have a higher return on equity, a higher return on sales. There are a number of different statistics related just to women, and then related to inclusive teams, inclusive organizations, and then on the teams, it was actually European organizations that did some of the first studies I saw related specifically to inclusive teams. So these are just some statistics for you to see the business case behind this, which some of you will need to be equipped with some of the people that you work with. So we threw those in there for you. We could talk more about that. And then,
Right, I'll take it over, Kristen.
that was good to see.
So just on the last note, Kristen mentioned on the business case, I think it's a interesting time we're having, because that's something I talk about a lot at the board level, which I work at, and beyond just profitability, which is huge, we have problems on the board on assumption making and bias, groupthink and bias, but groupthink and dynamics that really are problematic at a team level, which is what a board is. And so thinking about what the why is for your company is really important. It could be a financial argument, it could be an equity argument, it could be a values argument, but that's actually a really important part for the team, for the leadership to be clear about. Why do we care about investing in women and bringing them in? We know our companies are more successful. We're drawing in new talent. Whatever that why is, I think is a critical part of each of your success in implementing these broader ideas that we're mentioning. I'm going to go through these quickly, Kristen, because we are running out of time and I think we need to get questions, and we've been talking quite a bit. So just a couple more on investment for women in their career advancement that we have found to be particularly critical. One, everyone talks about mentorship and sponsorship. Ways to do that well. It's baked into the onboarding process. A new hire is matched with a more senior person right off the bat. And so she or he is hearing from them. This can go multiple ways. The new hire could be a man and they're partnered with a more senior woman and they're seeing, wow, there's a senior woman who knows what she's doing and is amazing. And I'm learning from her. That's just as important as a young woman being partnered with a senior male leader who has influence and success. So thinking about what that looks like, you could implement this in any kind of size organization. You could have a bank of employees who are wanting to be mentors. And maybe even more importantly, those mentors get an extra bonus in their financial or just an acknowledgement during when we're doing reviews of performance that they are mentoring in their organization. That's something we want to see, and you're encouraging that behavior. I'm going to keep going down quickly on this, Kristen, and then eliminating bias in the process of recruitment, which is a lot of ways we can do this. Some companies implement the Rooney Rule, which came out of sports in the US, where that when you have an open position, you always interview at least one or multiple women or people of color. This is inclusive of all the underrepresented groups that might exist in your organization. So really thinking about strategies to eliminate bias in the process in the recruitment. Another recommendation on that is to have a panel of people interviewing that are also diverse within your organization. So you're hearing different things. If you have the sort of same people hiring and they take in similar pieces, you can find bias in your assessment. A great example of this is in interviewing, oftentimes we might ask a question like, how have you done this in a previous job? Well, for underrepresented groups that may not have had the same opportunities to have done that, you may want to ask, how would you approach this? How would your thinking, what would your thinking look like? So you want to think about that in the way in which you're asking questions and who's doing that. A couple more recommendations. Thinking about your job descriptions being inclusive using language. So using terms that tend to be more aligned with men, dominant, competitive. We tend to see that alignment. And so thinking more, or even using the words like communal or patient or interpersonal could be more female oriented. So thinking about jobs that, drive growth, be a competitive thinker, thinking a little bit differently about the language we're using so that we try not to just in our description push away candidates that that may not think they're qualified. And I'm sure all of you have heard the statistic that women apply for jobs that they have 100% of the qualification for versus men they just need about half of that, and then they'll be like, sure, I can do the rest. So we know that's another dynamic that we're having a problem with. Again, I mentioned standardizing the interview process. Sorry, Kristen, I'm not sure where all your slides are on this because I want to get to Q&A. And lastly, I'll just say, building an inclusive brand is really big. So I'll just say in our work, particularly in the tech sector, we tend to see you obviously in a lot of sectors, but in tech, you have a lot of companies that women will self-select out of because they don't see women in leadership or they're not branded that way. So thinking about who is at the forefront, who is there visually on the website, who is interviewing, right? That is all going to impact the recruitment and the of the people that you're bringing in. So you want to really be cognizant of all of these dimensions. And I'm just going to stop there just because of, time, I hope that's okay, Carolina and Susan. We'd love to take some questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I don't see any questions in the chat, but I would love to invite folks to drop any questions into the chat. And while that's happening, we have some questions that we've come up with just to help get the dialogue rolling. And I guess maybe I'll start with the question of, I know not all of our REF members come from big organizations. So if there was one kind of piece of advice for people working in smaller organizations, whether they're the leader or, a key executive in the organization, what are some suggestions that they could do when they are in a smaller organization where they feel maybe there are less options for, right, implementing some of the recommendations that you guys have shared this morning?
So I have a couple of key ones. Many of the recommendations we talked about, I don't think cost a lot of money. It's just about creating structures in place. So I think that the perception that many of these projects might take, a lot of investment financially isn't the case. So a couple of ideas. One is just to the mentorship onboarding. I'll go back to that. You have to be intentional about it, but this could live with the HR team if there is one, or it could live with whoever hires at your company, that you develop a mentorship culture. What we have found that is effective with mentorship is to be both intentional and create a structure. So an expectation setting. I'm going to match Susan and Jessica to work together, and in the next month that they meet X number of times. That's one way to do it. And I would suggest you could also create a little bit more organicness along with the structure. So you might have an early meeting. Welcome to our company. We're going to have an event where there are mentors that are identified as mentors in the room, and I want you to have dialogue and conversation and see if there's someone who's a really is a good fit for you and you connect with. Bringing a little bit of structure and organicness together is the most effective. So that could be a project that you do that really starts helping that new hire, that new woman coming into the company, feeling like she has somebody that she can really rely on and connect with. I think that's a really good idea. The other piece that I think is crucial is internal communication between leadership and rank and file workers. This may be a little bit more complicated for a bigger company, but what you could do regardless of any size is create an employee resource group, just like this rough, incredible group within your company of men and women who care about creating a gender inclusive workplace, an inclusive workplace broadly. And they meet regularly to talk, hey, what are you hearing? What are some of the challenges we're seeing inside of our company? And then there is a defined time in which they present those things to leadership. So there's a real two-way street. And I think what's healthy about it is the leader saying, I want to hear from you. Tell me what it is. But I'll just say this word, and not to be crass, but it's not meant to be a bitch session.
Right.
That's probably a terrible word when we're talking about women, or a session where we're talking about like the bad things that, what's going on. This is meant to be a communication stream to leadership, so they really are acknowledging what's the dynamic. And I really think this is a big problem in a lot of different kinds of organizations, private sector and elsewhere, where they're not hearing from them. And if those leaders aren't hearing from the stakeholders, their employees, what the problems are, what are we seeing? Are we overworked? Is there women aren't being heard in meetings? We have these team meetings, and oh my gosh, I didn't even notice that. Those things start to come up when there's a structure behind it. So, Kristen, do you want to?
Yeah, in some cases, it's actually also been a DEI committee that's been in charge of this. So they've been the ones to sort of start a dialogue around the values, what are the values of the organization, or to kind of revisit them, or they've been the committee to sort of start to look at one of these processes to unbake the bias in the recruitment process, or the job descriptions, or some piece of that, working alongside HR. But that's also good because it gives the employees buy-in as a part of the process, the same way that the employee resource group does. But to have it as a part of the DEI committee is another way of doing it, and to have them formally tasked with this.
Caroline, I'll let you maybe feed some questions from the chat that have.
Yes, thank you, because we're talking about a mentoring topic, and Alejandra Candia asks, what are your thoughts on women mentoring women versus men mentoring women?
Both need to happen. Just like there's still a need, in my view, that as much as we talked about training women, it gets a little exhausting. There is a power in having women being together and talking about what they're experiencing. And then you also train men and women together in that similar thinking. With mentorship, you really want to create an environment where it's appropriate and okay for men to mentor women. We still are in contexts in which that can be seen as not appropriate, which needs to be gone. Because if that exists, there is a belief that men are somehow on a different plane from women in the way they're valued, in assuming some kind of inappropriate relationship. I'm just being very candid because we see this in other countries and in the US in some ways. So you want to have men and women being mentored and nurturing that. A great way to start is when you start a mentorship program, ensuring that senior men in the company are going to be mentors. That is, you have to have that. That is, we're not going to launch unless we have men stepping up and saying, this is important to me. I understand the need to do this. At the same time, I think there's a lot of value in having women mentoring women because of their life experience and that difference. So I know I'm both. Alejandra is my recommendation, and it's important to, I guess maybe in some ways more important that men and women are working together in a mentor-mentee relationship, because I think that really needs to be fostered to build this inclusion.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Another question that we have on the chat is, how are you seeing flexibility for women returning from maternity leave in the professional services industry, where there are very specific metric expectations for charge hours?
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing, Kristen, you go ahead. Or
Go ahead, Jess. I think this is still the most challenging industry, unfortunately. Yeah, I
we've
don't
done
think,
work, yeah, Ashley, with a number of them, and I work right now with a lot of professional services firms. It was the truth is it was the most dedicated women that I saw stick through it because of the over the years because of the travel requirement in particular. So whether they had just had a child and the travel requirement, or they have young children and the travel requirement of the professional services firms, I think actually COVID has helped that because there is, I think Deloitte was the largest user of flights in the world, right? For getting their consultants to different parts of the country for their client work. So I actually see less of that. So in some ways, I see a better balance for women. The other thing that's happening that is very, I think, also helpful is younger people, Gen Z in particular, women more broadly of all ages, are just like, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to leave, right? Or I'm going to only be here at this certain time. So I think losing that talent, I think companies are paying attention to losing that talent more, but a lot more needs to be done. And I would say, like, we've come up with ideas like sharing the roles, like you have multiple people on a client, and so in some ways you are restructuring how it's done. And I think that's really what's needed in a lot of companies, is reimagining, oh no, this is just how it's done, and if women don't fit in, sorry, I don't think that's going to work. And so that would be some thoughts for me on that. Yeah.
Kristen
think
has
it was,
ideas to add.
yeah, I think it was Deloitte or McKinsey, and I forget which one, where they were reimagining having kind of a Chicago-based person deal with, like, they were doing location-based rather than having people travel as much. And I think that came out of COVID, if I'm not mistaken. It didn't completely change how they restructured. I mean, there's still consultants traveling all of the time, but I know that there has been some restructuring around doing more location-based teams rather than having people have to travel all the time.
Yeah, the other, and I read the whole rest of your thing, Ashley. I'm super empathetic. I think this is, and we have a long way to go. This is still really intractable. I mean, really difficult. I'll be candid. I'll be like, the senior women I see in a lot of these professional services firms don't have children, and that's fine. That's their decision, but that's challenging if you're only allowing for women of a certain, position to be successful. And then it's the outlier. So I think that it creates internal agitators to say, hey, you want my, basically women pulling out and saying, I'm not going to come work here until this starts to change. Men stepping up and saying, I also want to be a parent. That's the number one dynamic that male, especially parents, but men also want flexibility. And I think until you have that, recognition, hey, we're not going to work the way that this existed. This needs to change to make this work for ourselves. I think that we're still in that process, and we have to get leaders that understand that. But I'm a little disappointed, candidly, in corporate America, in the United States, that there wasn't more of a reimagining of the workplace after COVID, when it was so clear that flexibility was so paramount and that people need to have more balance. So we have our work cut out for us still.
That's great, Jessica. And I think they're valuable insights that you give us. And we are really short on time, but I wanted to make one last question from the bunch I have here. What would be your advice to give women aspiring to leadership roles in the industry that are traditionally male dominated?
I mean, I would say that women who have gone into male dominated industries have gotten there by operating more in a male way. And I think we're moving into a time where the women going into male dominated industries need to be more aware of trying to leverage the unique capacities of women. I think we're opening up to a time where we need to be able to think about how women do use more empathy, and try to balance continuing to be aware of using and being aware of being in a male dominated environment and what that means and what that requires, with tapping into knowing that women add a tremendous amount of value and that we don't even know yet what that really looks like, because we haven't had, you know, a real huge amount of women in leadership around the world yet. And it's really exciting. It's going to be really exciting to see what that looks like. And so I hope that the women going into these male dominated sectors can tap into that and think about that as they're going in, and not just continue to do sort of what the women that went before them did.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that's right. We're evolving in our thinking. And so, and there's a couple things I'd say. One is it's critically necessary for women to be authentic in their own style, which can be much more difficult in a male dominated environment. And that said, I think in my experience working all over the world, like with Kristen for so many years on this, the more effective women, regardless of the industry they're working in, were more authentic and more
Yeah.
clear with, they're grounded in who they are. And this is who I am, and this is what I'm about, and this is how I'm going to lead. I'm thinking of Patty Poppe, who's the CEO of Pacific Gas and Electric, a multi-billion-dollar energy company here in California, Northern California, came from Michigan. Her quote, her mantra is lead with love. Do you think any men lead with love in their, I mean, in their, like, I mean, maybe, I'm sorry to be a little,
Definitely not stated.
I know,
Definitely wouldn't be
probably not
stated.
stated, right? So her
Right.
deal, she has just done a great job. I was just talking to a person who works there, and she's becoming this beloved CEO. So I think that's part, and energy has been male dominated for many years. It still is in many parts of the country and the world. And so that's one dynamic. And then can't do it alone. You cannot do this stuff alone. And that may mean that you're the only woman in the team, but you have a team of people. And this is why REF's important and why groups to support you. You have to have those people that you can talk to, like, hey, I'm dealing with this. How did you navigate this? I literally just had a very senior executive friend of mine, somebody that Kristen and I have both advised, who called me the other day. She literally had what Kristen had happen to her about, she was not invited to a meeting, that she's like in charge of this group, and she was specifically not invited at a very senior level, and she was pissed. But she knows she can call me and I can reframe it and be like, you know what? You're not valued by that CEO. You're gone. And is she good at her work? She's excellent. She's one of the best I've ever seen. So I think that we have to also, I know there's a lot of privilege in saying I'm just going to leave, but I think there is a power in using that we have to say, hey, listen, this isn't worth you're not valuing me, and that's what we need to do. So you're going to be great.
I want to honor everyone's time. We have less than a minute left, but I want to say a couple things. Kristen and Jessica, thank you so much for just the research and data and global breadth of the work that you guys have done to help us all understand that what may feel like uniquely local issues are really probably global issues that we just didn't know they were global issues. And so A, we're all in this together. B, I'm already ideating, Carolina, on what our next REF Women's event might be, which is kind of a continuation of today's discussion, but where have women in the REF world been successful at making a difference? And how do we sort of share some of those maybe best practices or ideas and create courage among all of us to use our voices to make a difference in the organizations and communities that we're involved in. And so I'm so inspired by what you guys have shared, and I'm super excited for our Q4 event and welcome input from all of you guys. That Fabri, do we do some type of post webinar survey so we can get input from folks? Where's our friend Fabri, who's our REF corporate supporter? Is that something we can do, Fabri?
Of course.
Okay, fabulous. So again, this will be posted and in the network. So if you know folks that weren't able to join us for any of or all of it, please encourage them to watch it. And obviously maybe we can put in the website, Carolina, maybe you can pop in the website, the Mind the Gap website, so folks can also go and learn more about the work that Kristen and Jessica have been leading. And just thank you all for being with us. And I know we're going to keep the conversation going and rolling. So
Yes, it was
you
a
all.
wonderful meeting. Thank you, everybody, to join. I think we will have a lot to talk. This is just the
we
beginning.
do. It's just the
And thank you
beginning.
for everybody to taking the time to be with us today.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you
Have a wonderful
all.
day.
All right.
Thank you.